Artist Talk. Zana is going to be in conversation with Harold Offeh, an interdisciplinary artist and tutor at the Royal College of Art in Contemporary Art Practice. I know this talk is going to be a great meeting of minds, so I very much look forward to this discussion, and without further ado, I'll pass over to Harold and Zana.
Thanks, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure for me to be here. I'd like to thank Hilary for inviting me and the whole of the October family. I should just say this gallery means a lot to me in terms of its history. It's a legendary institution and has had a tremendous impact, I think, on the art scene globally. And so when I got the invitation, I was even more excited. And then it's been a whole amazing process to enter this amazing world of Zana and this beautiful work and this beautiful show. Sorry, I'm going to be doing a lot of gushing, which might be a bit like sycophantic, but before we start, there are some maybe things that I will sort of use to maybe start the conversation going, but I also just wanted to kind of signal really to you, the audience, a little bit that we'll be having we'll talk for a little bit and we'll have some conversation between us. But I really would invite you to join the conversation. We'd like to kind of open this out as much as possible. Normally there's a kind of call for like questions, but I thought actually it'd be nice to kind of frame things. So it might not, we don't necessarily only just want your questions. It could be reflections or comments, or perhaps even just speaking to your experiences of the work. Those of you that have had a chance to see the show, I know some of you maybe haven't, but there will be a chance after. And we're lucky to kind of be here in the space. And I'm sort of kind of conscious of, there's a quote that I always kind of sort of think about in relation to encountering work. So the artist Sonia Boyce says, let's just talk about the work. Let's engage with the work in terms of what it is, materially, manifestly, in terms of our experience of it, speak to the work. So I would invite you to do that as well. I think the work is incredibly generous, so please join us. Don't feel like you have to frame and formulate an intelligent, theoretical, critical question, although those are also welcome. So, okay. Zana.
Hello.
Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate when people take time to share space and to share energy with all of us. So thank you so much once again for just coming out here today. Yeah.
I thought we might start a little bit as a way of kind of getting into the show with, if you could talk a little bit about the title of the exhibition and what that represents.
So the exhibition titled is called Nges'rhodlweni, a portal for Black joy, and the word Nges'rhodlweni refers to a space in the Ndebele household called Is'rhodlo, whereby it's usually centered in sort of the compound, and all ceremony, whether joyous or not, take place within this space. And it sort of acts as like this melting pot. Whenever the ceremony or celebration or ritual, it acts as this anchoring point of that ceremony where everyone sort of comes back to and uses it as a base. And so then growing up in Ndebele, I've always been fascinated, even though I was in the culture, I've always been fascinated by the ways and the values of Ndebele people. And so when I was doing this work, and when I started Ndebele Superhero, it became an even bigger fascination of just different ways of existing and different ways of being, which is something that I think I've searched for my entire life, because I'd go to school and I'd see this type of thing, and then I'd go home and I'd see something different. So this idea of integrating and using things from different cultures that are not necessarily culture specific, but transcend to the human experience, really. So I wanted to use this project and Nges'rhodlo as sort of the anchor for this body of work that anchors all these different rituals that we explore in the different series that we have, and really explore what it means to be joyous and what it means to be Black in that space. So for me, what I found it to be is freedom, and really just existing for yourself and for no one else, and existing on your own terms and not having your existence constantly be reactionary. So I explored that as Nges'rhodlo as sort of the main paradigm or the framework for these different rituals that take place in the preparation of ceremony, in the culmination and the manifestation of what I imagine as Black joy. That's a long answer, but yeah.
No, and it's a very rich one. I mean, I think we have the film playing as well, but something I think is kind of interesting and sort of central to the work is this notion of portals, and there's this fabulous publication that October have produced, and there's an interview with Laurie where you talk about this idea of the body, your body being a portal. And for me, there are these other symbolic portals, but I wondered if you could also sort of talk about that, the idea of the body and you particularly being a portal and what that might mean.
So it's going to go back to how I grew up, because a lot of these values and these things that I explore in my work are very much tied to that space. When I was younger, I was always curious about why certain things existed and why, especially things and rituals within the culture. And one particular ritual that I was super fascinated with was the ritual of initiation, when a coming of age ceremony that you sort of go under when, you know, my mom did it for us when we were 18, and some people do it younger. And so I would always ask my elders, so what happens there? What do you do? And all these different things. And the continued answer was, you have to live it to understand it. So it then takes away this idea of knowing from an intellectual perspective, and it makes it sort of an invitation of your wholeness as a human being. And so how you acquire information and how you learn, your body acts as a portal to access, because there are knowings that you get to experience and get to have by virtue of experiencing something and having that knowing live in your body. And so me using my body as a portal, being the subject of my work, really stems from that space of there are things that I know that I don't know, and through the experience awaken, you know, different memories that may not be tied to my own lifeline, but could be, you know, things that happened 4, 5, 6 generations ago. And that story needs to live in that particular time, at that particular moment. So as an artist, I'm always sensitive to that, and I'm always open to having these things come through me, you know, leaning on what I know about having also been initiated, leaning on that and knowing the significance of things living in your body and then projecting that to the world.
I'm sort of kind of mindful, because I think you sort of touched on it at the beginning of the film. I don't know, it's not necessarily a manifesto, but there are these really important statements. I wondered if I could just read them.
Yeah.
Hopefully I've transcribed them properly. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. So it says, our culture is not for sale. Our culture requires you to live it. You cannot outrun or outsmart our culture. Our culture feeds into itself. Our culture creates joy. Our culture lives in balance with nature. Our culture is infinite. And these sort of statements are kind of spoken. And in a way, for me, they're also like a portal that's sort of transporting us into this Ndebele world. But also, yeah, anyway. But so yeah, I was just kind of, again, interested in the kind of way that text, I think, really asserts itself in terms of framing the culture. And, you know, you talked a little bit about, like, our culture requires you to live it, and that framing of the kind of experience. And I guess I'm sort of rather clumsy trying to sort of frame a commentary into, like, the experience of the work, you know. You're talking about the sort of importance of a kind of lived culture as a way of kind of accessing it. I mean, I wonder how you feel about, in a way, the way in which you're sort of drawing on these amazing rich symbols and cultural traditions, and how they kind of come together in terms of the show, for example, or the film. It's not really a very... It's more of amusing. I'm not framing it as a kind of question, but it's something I'm really interested. Maybe it's like a we talked about the problem of translation. I don't think you're doing necessarily translation, but I guess I'm interested in that, like how, as somebody not immersed in that tradition, how I enter this. It feels like you kind of equip us with, you know, these visuals and these experiences. Yeah, I don't know if you could just speak to that. That's not a properly formed question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure. I get what you mean. So this project, when it first came to me, it was a very strange way in which it came into my orbit. Well, a lot of my projects come to me in very strange ways. So my process as an artist, I'm going to give you a long answer to like a very complicated
good
question.
Talk about process. That's really good.
My process is, so I'm a trained researcher. That's what I studied. I majored in politics and history. I studied international studies. I know how to do research really well. And so when I started, art has always been a part of my life because I'm Ndebele. So I've always been surrounded by art, but for us it wasn't really art. It just was the way in which you lived and you experienced the world. And so when I went into contemporary art, having had, you know, this myriad of experiences that I've had growing up at the intersection of African spirituality, studying natural systems, but also that's one side of my family where one of my grandfathers was, he knew medicine, he knew plants, and he was sort of like a healer. And then on the other side, having my grandfather be a bishop to a church, and then going to school and learning about science. So it was always this idea of different ways to learn and to understand different themes. And so I've always had this sort of expanded perspective to how I approach my work. And so this body of work, I was interrogating joy. Someone had asked me to be in 2020 during COVID. And the question, a lot of what I explore in my work, I always use the expression, Nges'rhodlweni, meaning how does this live in my culture? What does it look like? And so someone had asked me to be a part of a body of work, and I told them that I don't work alone in the manifestation of a work, not only in the crew that I have, but just energetically and spiritually. And so I told them that I'll have to ask for the work first, because it has to do with what I have to say at that particular time. Do I even have something to say? And so, you know, me and this person, things just fizzled out, and it was 2 months, nothing came. And I don't induce myself into a body of work because that's just not how I work. And so eventually one night, the work came. What you're just reading, it came like that, where I woke up, I think it was like 2, 3 a.m., or I woke up at 5, or I don't remember, but it was in the AMs. And I just wrote the script of this body of work. And the lines, the mantras, are what came first. And so then I wrote it, you know, until 9 in the morning. And then I knew what the work was going to be called, Nges'rhodlweni. I knew more or less, and then through the years I sort of refined it. And so to answer your question about sort of these mantras and existing in sort of the gallery space, what I've learned is that the art is. And as an artist, you have the opportunity to tap into that for a moment. You are invited. And, you know, oftentimes people say the art lives in us, but I've learned, for me, from my own personal experience, we live inside of it. And if anything, artists are servants to it. And so then what happens is that it visits and it sort of takes over your entire essence and your focus, and it demands to sort of be birthed. And so then you then give birth to it, given the context that you exist in, but you can't control the context. What you have control over is what you let in and the willingness of what you allow to come through. And so to bring it back to this idea of mediumship, because it touches on medium of, you know, having these cultural symbols, but also existing in a very contemporary space, it reminds me again of my grandmother, who was a beader. and she was a painter, and she was a gardener. And so all these different mediums that she tapped into explored the same thing. The context for her was Ndebele in a village. But the context can always change, but the essence of the thing that woke me up at 3 a.m. to write the script for this body of work, the thing that made my grandmother bead and weave and, you know, do all these different, it's the same energy. And so I try to not interrogate the energy too much, but rather cultivate a stillness and a silence to properly interpret whatever needs to be expressed at that particular time. So I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
I mean, maybe we can sort of talk a bit about Ndebele Superhero as a kind of character formation, and yeah, how that sort of that plays a role within the work and some of the works here as well.
Yeah, and Ndebele Superhero was created in 2017, I think. Yeah, 2017 when my brother went to initiation. But I think it was something that was budding in me way longer than that. Because when I left Ndebele and I moved to the city, what I started noticing was that a lot of people were not identifying as Ndebele. You know, when you are outside of South Africa, when you think South Africa, you see Ndebele and you hear Zulu. And so there was this voicelessness of Ndebele people. And Ndebele people were not represented, you know, like other cultures in South Africa. And we're a small culture, small group of people. And so I didn't understand it because I had lived the culture and it's so rich and it's so diverse. To me, it didn't make sense why anyone wouldn't want to be Ndebele. For me, it was like the best thing that could have happened to you. And so during that time, so those little seeds interacting with people who say, I'm not really Ndebele, yeah, like my dad is, but you know, all these different, yeah, maybe I'm Zulu, but basically opting to identify as something else other than because they didn't see it exist in sort of, you know, in the media and in all these different spaces. And so I think having those seeds be planted in me, and then I think, you know, and many other experiences, when my brother went to initiation, because the male initiation specifically happens every 4 years, so when it does happen, the energy just takes over the entire area for like 4 months. Everyone is almost like in a trance for like an entire village of people. And so when I was documenting that experience, that then is what basically was like the climax point for the birth of Ndebele Superhero, to say that we exist and we are not just backdrops to your photo shoots and colorful blankets and a nice print. There's so much symbolism, there's so much richness to the culture. And it was important for me to tell my little bit, you know, of what I know about that story, what I know about that experience. And so Ndebele Superhero sort of came as out of urgency to say that Ndebele people exist and they have voices and they speak and they are not frozen in time and they are evolving and they are changing and they have really interesting relationships with natural systems, with the water, with the river, with all these different things. And I think I made it my duty at that point to really tell of these stories, you know, and to tell them in a contemporary way. For now, I don't know what I might be doing like 10 years from now, but right now this feels like the right thing to do. So it was very important for me to then continue this relationship with Ndebele Superhero and really use it as a force that just goes and does it continuously over and over again.
You mentioned time there as well, I think, in that answer, and that's something I wanted to sort of touch on, particularly, again, with the video, but, you know, I say the other works, and how time plays a part. So within the film, there's this whole series of archives, I mean, it's on at the moment, that you kind of draw from, this like family archive, and there's this movement in time from these, you know, sequences, going back to these documentations, an archive of cultural rituals, and again, as part of that idea of the kind of portal, I kind of felt like you're constantly time traveling, moving backwards and forwards through Ndebele Superhero, even as a kind of projection of the contemporary and future, you know. So I wanted also to talk about that kind of conception of time, because as well, I think you also talk about within Ndebele culture that idea of cyclical time and circularity. Yeah, I wanted just your reflection on those things.
Yeah, sure. So time plays a huge role. It's a big theme in my work. I think time fascinates me. The idea of what exists now and ultimately when does time begin and when does it end. And, you know, growing up in Ndebele and, you know, like I said, we practiced African spirituality, but there was also a religious side to all these different things. I think my fascination with time started there, where I'd see things, for example, in my house that would happen, that if I go to school, are impossible. You know, I'd see things that were scientifically to be impossible, but I'd see them happen. And so that was, for me, people who would be able to be in multiple places at once and be able to say, for example, there's this lady that we knew who was a friend of ours, her body would be in one place, but her spirit could be split into 10 different places, and she could give you detailed, like, you know, things of this is what's happening here. She could give you ornaments. This is what I'm seeing a table. You know what I mean? And so I think at a very young age, that fascinates me, because when I go to school, you know, that's scientifically impossible. And so then I think then in my work, I infused it as a way to expand my own perspective of how I understand time and how, you know, ultimately I came to the conclusion that all things are real given the world that they live in and the world that they exist in. And so my work really is trying to expand these worlds and to see where they meet and where they connect and the role that time has in the bending and the moving and the changing of these different worlds that we all live in. So I think that's where the fascination with time comes from. Because in my culture, for example, time is it doesn't have an end, nor does it have a beginning. It is, just like art, it's just one of the things that are, like the sunrise, it is. And so then we can try to understand it the best we can, but our understanding of it doesn't do anything to its existence and what it will do. And so I think I took it as a thing, especially with the archive. This is like my dad is fascinated with time, and so he was like a photography video enthusiast, just archiving, keeping stuff, and my mom is like the complete opposite. So when my sister went to initiation in 2002, they had the means also to have people come and document, you know, this entire thing. And my dad always knew that at some point someone is gonna need it. So, they sort of facilitated this thing of archiving these moments, not only for themselves, but for us and for, you know, everyone else who's gonna come after us. And so I see the idea of time and art sort of operating at the same scale, because when my dad archived or commissioned people to archive, to document this ceremony, he didn't think that there would one day be a Ndebele Superhero and she would make a short film, and you know what I mean? And so I think it's like that as well, that service. Time also acts as a means to, or kind of like art, where you are also in service of it, and you sometimes create things that you may not understand, but you may feel the need to do, so that someone else along the line can pick it up and take it to a different place. So I think that's sort of an analogy of how time, a small analogy of how I understand time and how I've seen time play out in my community and in my culture, and yeah.
You mentioned a bit your mother, and I was thinking again about this role that kind of women play, so your grandmother, and learning from your grandmother, and I was thinking about your art school was through your grandmother, like through like all these kind of skills and conversations that come about through that, and then I think your mother is also in the film. I mean, just as a way in maybe to sort of talking about the role of kind of women, there's your sister's initiation as well, which Esther mentioned. If you could talk a little bit about that, the role that women play in Ndebele culture, but also how you're drawing that in. Oh, this sequence here is amazing, because that's your mum, isn't it? That right? And yeah, sorry. The advantages of having it played. It's just a really beautiful moment, because it's also, again, these cycles and these gestures that you kind of sort of play out.
Yeah, so women are extremely important in the Ndebele culture because they're almost like they are the holders of memory, of the sustenance and the longevity of the culture. For example, when you are born in the Ndebele culture, you get a name that you use until you get initiated. Then you get another name. And then you get married, then you get another name. And so speaking again to time, speaking again to cycles. And my mother's name is Kumbuza, meaning the one who holds memory. And interestingly enough, she actually is a cultural archivist. She knows a lot about the Ndebele culture and the Ndebele experience. And so in my work, it's my way of archiving her input and her imprint in just the culture as a whole. And I think honoring that divine, I think, femininity that sustains nations just worldwide. And so then I'm always trying to, also because I'm a woman, so I'll always, I think, speak from that perspective, but I try to honor my mother and the women that have influenced my work as much as I can, as a way of archiving them and as proof of their existence in the material world. I know the proof exists beyond that, but I think for the times that we're living in and for the disconnected, sort of context that we exist in, I think it's important for people to have tangible representations. But what I enjoy about what I do with my work is that the more you look, the more intangible it becomes, the more intangible the thing is. So the work is almost a tangible representation of an invitation to be expansive and to widen your perspective of what you have access to and what you can bring forth as an artist, as a creator, as any creative person, or as just as a human being. There's so much that we have access to that we often dismiss. And so my mother also embodies that. And so that sort of cycle of vulnerability and opening yourself up is a very feminine thing to do. And so I try the work, my mother, my sister, my grandmother, are like a law. They lure you in to go into the deepest parts of yourself and to not be scared to expand.
Thank you. Beautiful. I think we have another question. Yeah.
Yes, so my question is, I think something to do with invisibility. So I've been giving lectures for over 10 years now on invisibility in art, and I've focused on how the art industry, particularly art historians and art critics, have made black people invisible in art. So where a black person has been deliberately placed in a piece of art, they've just not been talked about, no attention focused on them. So William Hogarth would be famous, the most prolific painter of black people in Europe, and yet hundreds of books written about it and black people not mentioned in the art. And the one I'm thinking about in particular is Titian's work with Diana and Actaeon. And there's a black woman in that painting, and she's never talked about at all. So there's a kind of invisibility of black people. And so it's something I'm really interested in. Then I come to your show and I see the exact opposite. So what I see is a very tangible visibility and a proud visibility, and it's powerful, and you're drawn into it in a particular way. And it's interesting to hear talk about the inclusion of black, even in the framing and the borders, that it's there and it's in front of your eyes. And on the other hand, I see your images and your face in particular, and makes me think about Paul Laurence Dunbar poem where he talks about we wear the mask, because your face is evident and powerful. So we get a silhouette, and then we get the art on your face, which is absolutely beautiful, but it's clear and distinct that your culture is coming through. But coming to the point around invisibility, there is the covering of the face. For example, the megaphone, the disappearing of the head, which sometimes just it's going down. And then chief among the pictures of sort of like a vanishing face, let's say, it's the one behind you. A very powerful image. And there's no question in my mind as an art viewer that here is a black woman of culture but the face is disappearing. I just wondered if there was an artistic decision on your part to kind of focus the gaze on something else beyond the identity of the artist to something else that's bigger. I just wondered if your artistic decision had what was behind it, so we can understand a little bit more about that.
Yes, that was deliberate. It's deliberate in all of my work. I've found that in the West, there's a fascination with eyes. And I think that it's such a disservice to the totality of the human. So I'm often deliberately covering my face so that you can connect to the essence of what it is I am talking about, of what it is that I'm trying to sort of transcribe to the viewer. So the covering of the face is a deliberate thing that I think is another sort of an urge to expand our perception of what it means to be a human being, and to really try, instead of trying to look into the eyes or the features of a person or whatever, to really lean on connecting to the essence and the totality of the person. And I think that requires a level of stillness that in today's time we don't have. Because when I look into your eyes, I feel safe. Because that means I have eyes, you have eyes, you won't hurt me. But when I look like I don't have eyes, or my eyes are covered, or there's an obscurity going on, that forces you to pay attention. For a moment, you and I get to share presence. We get to be here now together in this moment. Irregardless of what the overarching feeling is of that emotion, it can be fear, it can be confusion, but you are here completely. And so that connection of the essence is what I'm always reaching to achieve in my work.
I mean, that's brilliant answer. No, yeah, it made me also sort of think about how really kind of through the kind of European canonical, you think about portraiture, like the role of portraiture as a way of like, understanding a particular personality through the face, through the features, and you're right, the eyes are central to that, the windows to the soul and all of those things. That, but very much about this idea of the kind of face particularly being emblematic of like an individual identity, like I can read that person by. And I think there is something, I think that's a really brilliant question as well, like in the way that one thinks differently when you don't have the eyes, or how you read the image, and there are other things that are kind of going on. It forces a much more sophisticated like engagement with the work. So yeah, thank you for that answer. Are there any other comments, questions? Oh, yes, please.
There's something that I always found like really interesting in what you had said about the fact that when you go, or when a woman goes through initiation, like for instance, like even her father don't really have like their say on what they do. So I wanted you to elaborate on, I don't know what it is, the power that yields to be initiated, what it means. Also like, yeah, patriarchy, matriarchy, and all of that, like what in the culture, and yeah.
Okay, so for me, so I am Ndebele Unzunza. I am Ijali, so these are just like the people that I come from. And so how I am initiated, I was initiated through the school or the faction. There's really no English for it, but of Mahlungulu. Mahlungulu is this mountain. The Mahlungulu people are named after this mountain. And so how our initiation practice more or less takes place is that it's basically a process of stillness and isolation for 2 months, where you are removed from the Western world and Western models. And what, for me, it cultivated and yielded was the idea of hearing myself from the inside. When I did it, I was 18. I was just before I went to university. So it was really a process of learning how to really hear yourself in a very loud world. So you must think back to this practice. This practice has existed for thousands of years. So it's literally proof that people have needed that time, even when we didn't have as much technology as we have now. It's very important just throughout your life to have moments where you anchor and you sort of bring yourself towards yourself and understand who you are right now and who you are becoming. Not so much who you've been, because that's gone, but who you are right now. So it's almost like a reckoning that happens. And so that is a human thing. It is not a black thing, it's not a Ndebele thing. It is a human need to be able to pause and to stop and to recon yourself so that you can then hear yourself at a deeper level, so that irregardless of the room or the space that you are in, you know what you sound like. And so some of the advantages of that, which is what Alexi mentioned, was after that process, you are your own person. Everyone in the culture recognizes that. So no one can tell you to do something. Like, no one can forcibly say, do this, because it is almost like a collective knowing that you now know yourself at the deepest level. People can advise. You know, my mother, my father can advise what they think, but once I've crossed that stage, they become advisors instead of people who tell me what to do. And so that process of stillness is rewarded, because then the most important voice will always be your inner voice. And that, I think, that then helps you navigate the different complexities that you are faced with in the world, irregardless of which culture you come from, irregardless of which race you come from. It is important to be able to hear yourself, because if you can hear yourself, you can survive in any time and you can survive in any place.
Also, like, so just additional question to that, like, so what happens to, is there an age for initiation, and what happens to people who grow far, you know, from the...
There isn't an age. It depends on the family. Like, my mother usually like, women would do it just before they get married. Not just before, but when you are in your marriage years, you might get married in a couple of years, then you do it. But for me, my mother, because we were living in a different time, so my mother did it for us just before we go to university, because we would be going into a new world. So she felt that it was important that we have this initiation happen right before, as we go into this strange and new world. And what was the second part of your question?
What happens if you grow somewhere, like in another part of the world? Do people often come to get initiated, you know?
I don't know of people who grow in different parts of the world, but I do know of, like, I was in the city. I wasn't in Ndebele my whole life. I lived in Pretoria for my high school years. And then I knew that at the end of my matric year, that last 2 months when everyone is going to rage and like summer break and they're gonna be partying all of December, I knew it's me and my bedroom and silence. So it's really specific. It's really family specific. If your family feels that it's important, they will bring you back home. No one's gonna force you to do it. Those who do are not fair. Those who force others to do it are not fair, but it's really something that you need to do out of your own accord, even though you may not understand it, because if you are forced into it, you miss the whole thing.
Just wanted to ask about the photographs or the images and the making of them, and whether the kind of operators constructed images where you kind of take a moment and then represent it outside your life, or whether there's something about the people you work with, that in themselves are kind of part of the experiences that you portray.
Yeah, so the production of this work, we had a crew, I'd say plus minus, of about 20 people. And so in the creation stage of the images, so the script comes 2020, I'm alone, I'm in my room, and then I sit with it. So my process usually, how I work is that, especially in choosing the photographer, for example, I always want to choose someone who I feel, whose style will complement the story that I want to tell at that time. And then after that, I have to meet with them and see if we connect and if we have like a good vibe. With just all my crew, I have to connect with them. If we don't connect, it's not gonna work. You could be the best at what you do, but if we don't connect, it's just not gonna work. And so then that sort of becomes what is the catalyst, because when we are on set, different things can happen. And so the connection that I share with my collaborators becomes what sets the parameters of the collaboration, because when our bodies cannot carry us, the connection that we formulated will. And so in this particular body of work, I wanted to honor my collaborators. And so when we were busy doing this, and it was sort of like an impromptu thing, but when we were doing the blue set, Ebandla, and I was in makeup, and it was like an open, because we're in the woods, like there's no one there, just us. And so it was super open plan vibes. And so crew would just be passing when the makeup artist was busy, and I'd ask them, what's your favorite number? And they'd give me the number, and then we'd just write it on. What's the most important date of your life? So everyone who was on set gave us a number. So the numbers that you see on the blue are very symbolic to the crew that was present on the day.
Question here, thank you.
Hello. I like how it's got many different layers, like all this different meanings. Like obviously you can see very deep in, but hearing you talk. And so I think I wonder like, when they acknowledge and see your work, do you start to see like a shift in them, or they, how they behave and how they talk to one another and things like this? So something along the lines of that anyway.
Yeah, so when Ndebele people, it's actually funny, because I did a project on it. So when Ndebele people first, some of them, not all of them, some of them, when they first interacted with the work, I remember I had done Proudly South African, which is a series that's also with October that we showed last year at 154. They were like, why does she have Nges'rhodlweni on her head, which is like a leg ring. They were like, oh my God. So then what they did was like, she initiated to try to basically like revoke my Ndebele card. But there are people, and that was really interesting, that experience, because my mom is an elder in the culture and in the tribe. So they would email my mom pictures of me, or like send them by WhatsApp, did you see this? Have you seen this? And thinking, I'm not my mom's daughter. So it was an interesting thing. And then there were people who would see it and they would remember. Because when you study culture, I've spent a lot of time in the Ndebele culture and understanding the culture. And what you realize is that black people have been inventing, black people have been evolving since the beginning of time. And so what colonialism did is disrupt that. And so a couple of years ago, I did a project called Time, actually, that speaks about when the regeneration of cultural knowledge was disrupted by slavery and colonialism. What ended up happening, I'll speak in the Ndebele culture, and I imagine in other cultures as well, is that the elders held on to the material because they took everything. The colonizers took everything from us, and so the little that we had left, we tried to hold on too tightly to it. And so what that did then, it caused like a disconnection between the elders as well as the young. So the regeneration of information of cultural practice was then interrupted, so the information couldn't flow anymore. And so what that then did is that it also stifled evolution of these myths, because the essence is the same. Whether right now it's a picture, 10 years from now, it might be something else. It's never about the medium. It's never about the thing, the essence of why we make. That's eternal. And so the work, my work, even for young Ndebele people, serves as a reminder that the essence, to not focus too much on the material, because the material can always change. But I understand the need for the fixation on the material, but to understand that the essence of what we make and why we make what we make is eternal, and we have access to it. And our job is just to create the environment for that thing to sort of manifest in our lives. And I think that's what the work is for Ndebele people too. It's a reminder that this hat that you see here, it was inspired by a hat my grandmother did for my dad years ago. And the original hat is similar objects. And there's nothing like deep about it. It's just like an expressive hat, kind of like how the people here, the white people, they paint and then they put it in a frame, and there's no explanation. It just is that. It's just it's an extension of an expression. It's not anything else but just, you know, a playful, expressive thing that needs to exist. And so, yeah, so really that's what I try to do with the work. And when the people receive it like that, it brings me great joy. And I'm really grateful that I get to do it, that I get to be a part of the process that awakens us to the eternal power and the essence of why we make and when we make, and, you know, just the essence of what we make.
Have you spoken about your sculptures? Because like I know it's
oh yes,
something like, I mean, really new for you. And
yeah.
Like, do you want to speak about them?
Yeah. So the sculptures are called Umfaza Mabela Mate. Umfaza Mabela Mate. It's like a line in my clan name. So they say when Umfaza Mabela Mate, owafumate sumntwana ngaphetsheya keligwane ligwanana. Meaning, it's actually one of the few times in the clan names where you hear a woman honored. And she's basically Mother Earth. That's how I imagine her. She's the great mother of creation. Amabele is an indigenous African grain called sorghum. So the great mother being linked to sorghum and all of that. And so I wanted to, when I couldn't do the pictures, I felt like it's as if I needed a mothering from the earth. So I was doing, during my time last year of coming back into my light and understanding what this expanded perspective that I now have has, sort of how it impacts my life and my practice. It was as if like I was reconnecting to the mothering. So I went back to basics, for lack of a better word. And my basics became steel and beadwork. And making the work was very healing. The work is inspired by umkwalo, which is the Ndebele geometric patterns. And it being the language of the gods, I felt like I was honoring the language of Umfaza Mabela Mate through reinterpreting these symbols in a completely new and different medium. So it was a very sort of healing process for me to make the sculptures and exploring this new medium. Because when you work with steel, you think it's a hard like material, but it's really not. It's very delicate. It's very, you know, and one mistake, like you can fix it, but it's like, you know. So it's a very like delicate material to work with. And I feel like it mirrored the place I was in last year. And so I wanted to honor that in this body of work.
Brilliant. No, thank you for that last reference. It's good. I mean, the sculptures are kind of in the corners here for the people who haven't seen. I mean, they will be kind of brought out. Okay, I could go for another hour, but we're going to bring things to an end. Thank you so much. Huge thanks to Zana for the show, for the really, really brilliant words and, yeah, everything. But, yeah, thank you so much for coming. And yeah, have a good rest of the weekend. Thank you.